Hello there, dear listeners. Before we begin tonight's tale, I hope your day has treated you kindly, wherever you may be in this vast world of ours. Perhaps it's evening where you are, or maybe the quiet hours of early morning have found you seeking rest. Whether you're listening from bustling cities or peaceful countryside, from mountain peaks or seaside shores, know that you're welcome here in this sacred space we've created together. If you find comfort in these stories, please consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber, where we gather each night to explore the timeless truths that have guided humanity through the ages. Tonight, we journey back through the mists of time to ancient Babylon, to a night when the very finger of the divine wrote upon palace walls, and an empire learned that no earthly power stands beyond the reach of heaven's justice. The year was 539, before the Common Era, and the great city of Babylon sprawled along the banks of the Euphrates River like a jewel cast upon the earth. Within its towering walls, the hanging gardens cascaded in verdant terraces. The Tower of Babel reached toward the heavens, and the palace of King Belshazzar gleamed with the accumulated wealth of conquered nations. On this particular evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, the palace hummed with preparation for a feast unlike any other. Servants scurried through corridors lined with glazed brick murals depicting lions and dragons, carrying platters of delicacies from every corner of the known world. The finest wines from the hills of Judah, exotic spices from distant India, and fruits that glistened like precious stones filled the tables. King Belshazzar, grandson of the great Nebuchadnezzar, had spared no expense. The banquet hall stretched vast as a temple, its ceiling supported by columns carved from single blocks of marble, each one telling the story of Babylonian conquest and glory. Golden lamps suspended on silver chains cast dancing shadows across walls adorned with tapestries, depicting the gods of Babylon in all their imagined splendour. Yet beyond the palace walls, unseen by the revellers within, the armies of Cyrus the Persian stretched across the horizon like a dark sea. For months they had laid siege to the great city, but Babylon's walls had never been breached, her gates never forced. The Babylonians had grown complacent in their strength, confident that their city was impregnable, their empire eternal. As night fell and torches blazed to life throughout the city, 1,000 noble guests made their way through the palace gates. They came dressed in silk and purple, adorned with gold and precious stones, their laughter echoing through the corridors as they anticipated the evening's pleasures. The sound of lyres and flutes drifted through the warm air, mingling with the voices of singers whose melodies spoke of victory and endless prosperity. King Belshazzar himself appeared resplendent in robes of deepest blue, a golden crown upon his brow, rings flashing on his fingers as he gestured grandly to his guests. He was a man in the prime of life, his beard oiled and perfumed, his eyes bright with wine and confidence. This night, he had declared, would be remembered for generations as the greatest feast Babylon had ever witnessed. But even as the celebration reached its crescendo, even as the wine flowed like water and the music swelled to fill every corner of the vast hall, dark currents moved beneath the surface of the evening's joy. For this was not merely a feast, but an act of defiance against the very heavens themselves. As the evening wore on and the wine loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions, King Belshazzar rose from his golden throne, swaying slightly as he surveyed the sea of faces before him. The hall fell gradually silent, 1,000 conversations dying away as all eyes turned toward their sovereign. In the flickering lamplight, his face bore an expression of cruel amusement, as if he harboured some secret that would shock and delight his guests. "My lords and ladies," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the vast space, "tonight we celebrate not merely the glory of Babylon, but the supremacy of our gods over all the earth. We have conquered nations, we have humbled kings, and we have taken the treasures of their temples as trophies of our victories." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Many of the nobles present had been part of those conquests, had seen the wealth of distant lands flow into Babylon's coffers. They raised their goblets in salute, the wine within glinting like liquid rubies in the torchlight. But Belshazzar was not finished. His eyes gleamed with a dangerous light as he continued, "Yet there is one treasure, taken from one temple, that we have never properly honoured. Tonight that changes." He clapped his hands, and servants appeared as if from nowhere, carrying between them objects that made the assembled nobles gasp in recognition and wonder. These were vessels of pure gold and silver, wrought with such exquisite craftsmanship that they seemed to glow within a light. Cups and bowls, pitchers and goblets, each one a masterpiece of the metalworker's art. These were the sacred vessels of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, taken by Nebuchadnezzar when he conquered that holy city decades before. They had been stored away in the temple of Marduk, treated with the respectful caution due to objects sacred to another people's god. But tonight, under the influence of wine and the intoxication of power, Belshazzar had decided to make them part of his feast. "Behold," the king proclaimed, lifting one of the golden goblets high above his head, "the vessels of the God of the Jews, who could not protect his own temple from our armies, whose people even now languish in exile throughout our empire. Tonight we drink from these cups and show all the world which gods truly hold dominion over the earth." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, though some of the older nobles shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They remembered the strange stories told about the Hebrew God, the plagues that had befallen Egypt, the walls of Jericho falling at the blast of trumpets. But wine and peer pressure overcame their caution, and soon they too were caught up in the moment's enthusiasm. Servants moved through the hall, distributing the sacred vessels among the guests. Belshazzar himself took the largest of the golden goblets, a magnificent piece that had once held wine, blessed by the priests of the Most High God. He filled it to the brim with the finest vintage from his royal cellars, the red wine dark as blood in the sacred cup. "To Marduk, chief of our gods," he cried, raising the goblet high, "who gives us victory over all our enemies." The assembled throng raised their own sacred vessels, taken from the very altar of the Lord. "To Marduk," they chorused, their voices echoing off the marble walls. But Belshazzar was not content with honouring just one deity. As the evening progressed and the wine continued to flow, he led toast after toast, each one more blasphemous than the last. "To the gods of gold," he proclaimed, and the crowd drank deeply from vessels that had once held the showbread of the temple. "To the gods of silver," he continued, as goblets that had caught the blood of sacrifices now brimmed with Babylonian wine. "To the gods of bronze and iron," the king shouted, his voice growing hoarser with each proclamation. "To the gods of wood and stone, who have made Babylon the greatest empire the world has ever seen." With each toast the revelry grew wilder, the laughter louder, the dancing more frenzied. Noble ladies spun in their silk gowns, their jewellery catching the lamplight as they moved. Men struck up drinking songs, their voices blending in harmony that spoke of triumph and excess. The very air seemed thick with incense and wine fumes, creating an atmosphere of decadent celebration. But high above the palace, in the courts of heaven, other eyes watched this display of pride and blasphemy. The sacred vessels, fashioned for the worship of the one true God, profaned by lips that praised idols of metal and wood. The moment had come for divine justice to make itself known upon the earth. It was in the midst of the wildest revelry, as the feast reached its crescendo of blasphemous celebration, that the atmosphere in the great hall began to change. At first it was subtle, a gradual shift that few noticed amid the chaos of music and laughter. The temperature seemed to drop slightly, though the braziers still burned brightly, and the press of bodies should have kept the air warm. A strange stillness crept into the room, not the absence of sound, but something deeper, as if the very air had grown heavy with an unseen presence. King Belshazzar stood near his throne, swaying slightly from the effects of wine, his golden goblet raised in yet another toast to the gods of Babylon. His nobles surrounded him, their faces flushed with drink and excitement, sacred vessels clutched in their hands as they prepared to echo their sovereign's words. The musicians played with passionate intensity, their instruments weaving melodies that spoke of earthly glory and endless prosperity. And then, in the space of a single heartbeat, everything changed. The music faltered first, not as if the musicians had stopped playing, but as if the very air had grown too thick to carry their melodies. Conversations died mid-sentence, laughter cut off as abruptly as if severed by a blade. Even the flickering flames of the lamps seemed to burn lower, their light growing dim and uncertain. It was then that someone screamed. The cry came from a noble woman near the eastern wall, her voice sharp with terror as her trembling finger pointed upward. Every head in the vast hall turned to follow her gaze, and what they saw there drove the colour from their faces and the strength from their limbs. There, upon the wall directly opposite the king's throne, a human hand had appeared, not attached to any arm or body, but suspended in the air as if emerging from the very substance of eternity itself. The hand was illuminated by its own light, pale and ghostly, yet undeniably real, casting shadows that danced across the painted murals of Babylonian gods. The fingers were long and elegant, neither young nor old, but possessed of a timeless quality that spoke of power beyond human understanding. They moved with deliberate precision, as if guided by a will that brooked no resistance, no hesitation. And as the assembled throng watched in growing horror, those fingers began to write. The writing appeared as lines of fire upon the polished marble, each character burning itself into the stone with the permanence of divine judgment. The script was unlike any earthly language, neither Babylonian cuneiform nor Hebrew letters, but something older and more fundamental, as if the very essence of meaning was being carved directly into reality itself. King Belshazzar felt his knees begin to shake, his golden goblet slipping from nerveless fingers to shatter upon the floor. The sacred vessel that moments before had held wine, offered in mockery to false gods, now lay broken, its precious contents spreading like blood across the marble. His face, so recently flushed with wine and arrogance, had gone pale as death, his eyes wide with a terror he had never before experienced. The hand continued its work, unmoved by the chaos it had caused in the hall below. Characters appeared one after another, each one blazing within a fire before settling into a steady glow that seemed to penetrate the very souls of all who looked upon it. The writing was clear and bold, demanding attention, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Around the hall, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Some of the nobles had fallen to their knees, whether from terror or instinctive reverence, it was impossible to say. Others pressed against the walls, as if trying to escape through solid stone, their eyes never leaving the supernatural display before them. The sacred vessels of Solomon's temple lay scattered across the floor, abandoned by hands that now trembled too violently to hold them. The musicians had long since set down their instruments, their faces pale masks of fear. Servants cowered in doorways, torn between the desire to flee and their duty to remain. The dancing girls who moments before had spun and laughed now stood frozen like statues, their silk scarves trailing forgotten around their feet. But it was upon King Belshazzar that the greatest terror fell, as the ruler who had ordered the profanation of the sacred vessels As the one who had led the blasphemous toasts, he felt the weight of divine displeasure focusing upon him like the heat of a burning glass. His crown, so recently a symbol of earthly power, now felt heavy as lead upon his brow. His royal robes, dyed in the finest purples and blues, seemed to hang upon him like grave clothes. The hand finished its work and faded from view as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the words burning upon the wall like coals of fire. But even in its absence, the presence that had guided it remained, filling the hall with an atmosphere of judgment that made every breath a struggle. Silence reigned in the great banquet hall of Babylon, broken only by the occasional sob or whispered prayer. The greatest feast in the empire's history had become a scene of terror and divine revelation, and upon the wall, where gods and heroes had been painted in their imagined glory, 4 words now blazed with the fire of heaven's judgment. MENE, MENE, TEKEL, Parsin. In the awful silence that followed the hand's disappearance, King Belshazzar stood transfixed, his gaze locked upon the burning words that seemed to sear themselves deeper into his consciousness with each passing moment. The weight of divine judgment pressed down upon the hall like a physical force, and the king's breath came in short, sharp gasps, as if the very air had grown too thin to sustain life. Gradually, as the initial shock began to wear off, the practical reality of the situation asserted itself. Here were words written by a supernatural hand, clearly intended as some form of message or warning, but their meaning remained utterly mysterious. The script was unlike anything in the libraries of Babylon, the characters seeming to shift and dance, even as they maintained their fixed positions upon the wall. "The wise men," Belshazzar managed to croak, his voice barely recognisable. "Summon all the wise men of Babylon, every magician, every astrologer, every diviner in the city. Bring them here at once." His command galvanised the paralysed servants into action. They scattered like leaves before a wind, grateful for any excuse to leave the presence of those terrifying words. Throughout the palace and into the city they ran, pounding upon doors and rousing from sleep the learned men whose wisdom had served the empire for generations. The first to arrive were the court magicians, men whose elaborate robes and mystical instruments had earned them places of honour at royal ceremonies. They entered the banquet hall with confidence, their heads held high and their voices ready with the usual formulas of greeting and flattery. But one look at the writing upon the wall, one glimpse of those characters that seemed to burn within a fire, and their confidence evaporated like mist before the sun. They approached the wall cautiously, their heads tilted at various angles as they studied the mysterious script. They consulted ancient tablets and scrolls, compared the characters to every known form of writing, whispered incantations and cast lots according to their various arts. But though they laboured long into the night, turning the problem over from every conceivable angle, they could make no sense of the divine message. The astrologers came next, men who claimed to read the future in the movements of stars and planets. They examined the writing with instruments of bronze and silver, measuring the angles and proportions of each character as if they were constellations written across the heavens. They calculated and computed, referenced their star charts, and consulted their ancient tables, but the meaning of the words remained as hidden as the dark side of the moon. As the hours passed, more and more of Babylon's learned men arrived at the palace, priests of Marduk and Ishtar, scholars who had studied in the great libraries, men whose reputations for wisdom extended throughout the known world. Each group brought their own methods and their own certainty that they would succeed where others had failed. Yet one by one, they too were forced to admit defeat before the mystery of the burning words. King Belshazzar grew increasingly desperate as each attempt failed. He paced before his throne like a caged lion, his robes dishevelled and his crown askew. The sacred vessels of Solomon's temple lay scattered and forgotten across the floor, their golden surfaces reflecting the supernatural light from the wall in fractured gleams that hurt the eyes to look upon. "Gold," the king proclaimed suddenly, his voice cracking with strain. "I will give gold beyond counting to whoever can read these words. Silver and precious stones, lands and titles, whatever they desire shall be theirs." But even the promise of unlimited wealth could not unlock the meaning of heaven's message. The wise men huddled together in small groups, whispering their theories and hypotheses, but none dared claim understanding of what clearly lay beyond human comprehension. It was then, as the night wore on toward dawn and desperation reached its peak, that a new figure entered the banquet hall. She was an elderly woman, her hair white as snow, but her back still straight and her eyes bright with intelligence. This was Nitocris, the Queen Mother, widow of Nebuchadnezzar and grandmother to Belshazzar himself. She had heard the commotion from her private quarters, had seen the servants running through the corridors, and felt the strange oppression that seemed to hang over the entire palace. Now she made her way through the crowd of baffled wise men, her presence commanding respect even in the midst of chaos. "My Lord King," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, despite her advanced years. "I see that you are troubled, that the colour has left your face and your limbs shake with fear. Do not let your thoughts alarm you, and do not look so pale." Belshazzar turned toward her, her hope flickering in his eyes like a candle flame in a dark room. "Grandmother, you have seen much in your long life. You were wife to great Nebuchadnezzar. You know the secrets of the empire. Can you tell me what these words mean?" The Queen Mother approached the wall, studying the burning characters with the careful attention of one who had witnessed many supernatural events during her husband's reign. "I cannot read these words, my grandson," she said at length, "but I know of one who might." She turned back to face the assembly, her aged voice somehow carrying more authority than all the learned men combined. "There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your grandfather, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. King Nebuchadnezzar appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers." A murmur ran through the crowd at these words. Many of the older nobles remembered stories from Nebuchadnezzar's time, tales of a Hebrew exile who had interpreted dreams and solved mysteries that baffled all others. But in the years since the great king's death, this man had faded from prominence, forgotten in the new reign's focus on younger advisers. "This man Daniel," the Queen Mother continued, "whom the king named Belshazzar, has an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems. Let Daniel be called, and he will tell you what the writing means." As the name Daniel echoed through the hall, Belshazzar felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. He had heard the stories, knew of the Hebrew's reputation for wisdom and divine favour, but he also knew that Daniel had served his grandfather faithfully and might not be inclined to help the king who had dishonoured the vessels of his people's God. Nevertheless, desperation overcame pride, and Belshazzar gave the command, "Find Daniel the Hebrew, bring him here immediately. If he can read these words, he shall be clothed in purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." As servants rushed to obey this new command, the burning words continued to glow upon the wall, patient as eternity, waiting for the one who had been chosen to unlock their meaning and pronounce the doom of Babylon. The dawn was breaking over Babylon when Daniel arrived at the palace, summoned from sleep by urgent messengers, who spoke in hushed, fearful tones of supernatural writing and royal desperation. He was an old man now, his beard white with age and his face marked by the lines of many years spent in faithful service to foreign kings. Yet his eyes remained clear and bright reflecting a wisdom that came not from human learning, but from communion with the eternal God. As he entered the banquet hall, Daniel paused for a moment to take in the scene before him. The remnants of the great feast lay scattered about like the debris of a broken dream. Golden plates and silver cups, many of them the sacred vessels of Solomon's temple, littered the floor, among pools of spilled wine and trampled delicacies. The nobles who had revelled so wildly just hours before now stood in small frightened groups, their fine clothes dishevelled and their faces pale with terror. But it was the writing upon the wall that commanded his attention, those 4 words blazing with divine fire that no earthly wisdom could extinguish. Daniel looked upon them without fear, for he recognised the hand that had written them, and he understood that he stood in the presence of the Almighty's judgment. King Belshazzar approached him with hasty, desperate steps, his royal dignity forgotten in his need for answers. "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, whom my grandfather the king brought from Judah?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I have heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you." The king gestured toward the wall with a trembling hand. "Now the wise men and enchanters have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom." Daniel listened to these promises of wealth and power with the patience of one who had seen empires rise and fall, who had served in the courts of kings and understood the vanity of earthly honours. When Belshazzar finished speaking, the old prophet's response came with quiet authority that somehow filled the vast hall more completely than the king's desperate entreaties. "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another," Daniel said, his voice calm and steady in the face of royal panic. "Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation." But before he would interpret the supernatural message, Daniel had words of his own to speak, words that cut to the heart of the night's blasphemous revelry, and laid bare the spiritual rebellion that had brought divine judgment upon Babylon. "O king," he began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, "the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your grandfather, kingship, and greatness, and glory, and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled." The assembled nobles listened in growing discomfort as Daniel recounted the story they all knew but preferred to forget. Nebuchadnezzar's pride, his claim to have built Babylon by his own power and for his own glory, and the terrible judgment that followed. How the great king had been driven from among men to live like a beast in the wilderness, eating grass like an ox, and letting his hair grow long as eagle's feathers and his nails like birds' claws. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, Daniel continued, his eyes never leaving Belshazzar's face, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind, and sets over it whom he will. The silence in the hall was absolute as Daniel paused, letting the weight of his words sink into the hearts of all who heard them. Then, with the authority of one who spoke for the God of heaven, he delivered his devastating rebuke. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, he declared, his voice now ringing with prophetic power. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways you have not honoured. Each word fell upon the assembled company like blows from a hammer, shattering their illusions of security and exposing the full extent of their rebellion against the Most High. Belshazzar himself seemed to shrink before Daniel's accusing words, his royal robes hanging loose about his diminished frame, his crown sitting askew upon a head bowed with shame and terror. The sacred vessels lay scattered around the hall like silent witnesses to the truth of Daniel's words. These cups and bowls, crafted for the worship of the one true God, had been defiled by lips that praised idols of metal and stone. The wine that had flowed so freely in blasphemous toasts now seemed to accuse those who had drunk it, its red stains upon the marble floor like drops of blood that cried out for justice. Then from his presence the hand was sent, Daniel concluded, pointing toward the burning words upon the wall, and this writing was inscribed. The hall remained wrapped in profound silence, as all waited to hear the interpretation that would seal Babylon's fate. The wise men who had laboured through the night stood humbled before this Hebrew exile who had succeeded where they had failed. The nobles who had revelled in their blasphemy now cowered before the prospect of divine judgment. And King Belshazzar, who had thought himself secure in his power, waited to hear the doom that had been written by the finger of God upon his palace wall. Daniel turned from the cowering king to face the wall where the divine words blazed with undiminished fire. The characters seemed to pulse within a light, each one carrying the weight of heaven's judgment and the certainty of prophetic fulfillment. In the profound silence of the great hall, the aged prophet lifted his voice and began to speak the words that would seal the fate of the Babylonian Empire. And this is the writing that was inscribed, Daniel announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. MENE, MENE, TEKEL, and parsin. He paused, allowing the strange words to echo through the hall, their sounds somehow both foreign and familiar, like a half-remembered dream that carries portents of future sorrow. The assembled nobles leaned forward despite their fear, desperate to understand the message that had struck such terror into their hearts. This is the interpretation of the matter, Daniel continued, his aged voice gaining strength as he spoke for the God of heaven. MENE, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. The first word fell upon the assembly like a death sentence. Here was the divine accountant taking inventory of Belshazzar's reign, counting each day of blasphemy and rebellion, each moment of pride and defiance against the Most High. The king's face went even paler, if such a thing were possible, and several of the nobles gasped aloud at the finality of the pronouncement. But Daniel was not finished. The second judgment followed hard upon the first, each word a hammer blow against the foundations of Babylonian pride. TEKEL, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Here was the divine judge placing Belshazzar's reign, his character, his very soul, upon the perfect scales of heaven's justice. And the verdict was damning beyond appeal. Found wanting, found lacking, found insufficient when measured against the standards of righteousness and truth. The king, who had thought himself great in his own eyes, was revealed to be nothing more than a feather in the balance when weighed against divine holiness. Belshazzar's knees gave way completely at these words, and he would have fallen had not two of his guards stepped forward to support him. The golden crown tumbled from his head to ring against the marble floor, the sound echoing through the hall like a funeral bell. His royal robes, so recently symbols of power and majesty, now seemed to hang upon him like burial shrouds. Perez, Daniel proclaimed, using the singular form of the final word, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The last judgment was perhaps the most terrible of all, for it spoke not merely of the king's personal doom, but of the end of the empire itself. Babylon, the golden head of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the city that had ruled the world with rod of iron, was to be divided like a carcass among its enemies. The Medes and Persians, even now camped outside the city walls, would soon walk through its gates as conquerors and claim its treasures as their own. A wail of despair went up from some of the assembled nobles as the full weight of the prophecy struck home. They had thought themselves secure behind Babylon's mighty walls, protected by their gods and their armies from any earthly threat. But now they understood that their true enemy was not the Persian host outside their gates, but the God of heaven himself, against whom no wall could stand and no army could prevail. Daniel stood unmoved amid the chaos of fear and lamentation, his weathered face reflecting the sorrow of one who took no pleasure in the pronouncement of judgment, yet understood its necessity. He had served this empire faithfully for decades, had helped to interpret its dreams and solve its mysteries, but he had also watched its gradual descent into pride and blasphemy, its increasing defiance of the God who held its breath in his hands. The Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, he said, his voice cutting through the din of panic and despair. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. These words, drawn from his own experience of divine revelation, served as both comfort and warning to all who heard them. Comfort to those who trusted in the sovereign God, for they could be assured that no earthly power could stand against his ultimate purposes, but warning to those who set themselves against heaven's will, for they would surely be brought low in their appointed time. King Belshazzar, supported now by his guards and struggling to maintain even a semblance of royal dignity, looked up at Daniel with eyes haunted by the certainty of doom. Yet even in his extremity, he sought to honour his promise to the man who had solved the mystery that had baffled all his wise men. "Clothe Daniel with purple," he commanded, in a voice barely above a whisper, "and put a chain of gold around his neck, and proclaim that he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." It was a pathetic gesture, the dying king attempting to bestow honours, even as his kingdom crumbled around him. The purple robe was brought, the golden chain placed around Daniel's neck, but these earthly symbols of power seemed hollow and meaningless in the face of the divine judgment that had been pronounced. Daniel accepted the honours not for their own sake, but as a testimony to the truth of his words. When the people saw that the king himself acknowledged the accuracy of the Hebrew prophet's interpretation, they would know that the doom of Babylon was certain and that the God of Israel was indeed sovereign over all earthly kingdoms. As the purple robes settled around Daniel's aged shoulders and the golden chain caught the light of the supernatural writing on the wall, the contrast could not have been more stark. Here stood a man clothed with earthly honours, yet serving a heavenly king, while around him an empire clothed in pride and blasphemy faced its final hour of judgment. The words on the wall continued to burn with undiminished intensity, their message now fully revealed but their power unabated. They served as a permanent reminder that the kingdoms of this world are temporary, subject to the sovereign will of the God who numbers their days and weighs their deeds in the balance of perfect justice. Even as Daniel spoke his interpretation and received the hollow honours of a doomed king, the wheels of divine judgment were already turning beyond the palace walls. For months, the Persian army under Cyrus had maintained their siege of the great city, but the Babylonians had felt secure behind walls that had never been breached by any earthly foe. They had provisions to last for years, abundant water from the Euphrates River, and an unshakable confidence in the strength of their defences. But on this night, as supernatural writing blazed upon the palace wall and prophecy sealed the empire's fate, Cyrus was putting into motion a plan of breathtaking audacity that would prove that no human fortress can stand against the purposes of the Almighty. The Euphrates River, which flowed through the heart of Babylon and provided both water and transportation for the great city, was also its greatest vulnerability. The river entered the city through massive gates that could be lowered into the water, and it flowed beneath the walls through channels that were thought to be too narrow and well defended for any army to use as an entrance. But Cyrus had spent months studying these defences, and his engineers had been working tirelessly upstream from the city, digging channels and building dams that would allow them to divert the mighty river from its course. The work had been done quietly, secretly, hidden from Babylonian scouts by the darkness of night and the cleverness of Persian engineering. As the banquet hall erupted in chaos at Daniel's interpretation, as nobles fled in terror and servants cowered in corners, the Persian engineers upstream were opening their carefully constructed channels. The waters of the Euphrates, which had flowed through Babylon for centuries, began to turn aside into the new channels that Cyrus had prepared. At first the change was barely noticeable. The river level dropped slowly, gradually, as if affected by nothing more than seasonal variations. But as more water was diverted, as the new channels carried away the river's flow, the level within the city began to drop significantly. By midnight, Persian soldiers were wading through knee-deep water where once the river had flowed deep and strong. They moved silently through the darkness, following the riverbed beneath the great walls of Babylon, their weapons wrapped in cloth to prevent any sound that might alert the guards above. The Babylonian sentries, focused on watching for attacks against the massive gates and towering walls, never thought to look down at the river that had always been their protection. They were drunk on wine from the royal feast, their attention scattered by the strange reports of supernatural writing in the palace, their confidence unshaken by any thought that their impregnable city could fall in a single night. The first Persian soldiers emerged from the river channels near the heart of the city, just as Daniel finished pronouncing his interpretation. While the prophet spoke of kingdoms divided and given to the Medes and Persians, those very conquerors were already inside Babylon's walls, moving swiftly through streets where citizens slept peacefully, unaware that their empire was breathing its last. The palace guards, those few who remained at their posts while most had crowded into the banquet hall to witness the supernatural spectacle, were overwhelmed before they could raise an alarm. Persian steel, sharp and silent in the darkness, found its mark with deadly efficiency. Within minutes, the palace was secured, its approaches controlled by Cyrus's elite troops. In the banquet hall, King Belshazzar was still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of his doom when the great doors burst open and Persian soldiers poured into the room. The nobles, already terrified by the supernatural writing and Daniel's interpretation, now faced the earthly fulfillment of heaven's judgment. Some tried to flee, but found every exit blocked by armed men. Others fell to their knees, begging for mercy that would not come. The sacred vessels of Solomon's temple, scattered across the floor where they had been dropped in blasphemous revelry, now reflected the gleam of Persian bronze and steel in their golden surfaces. Belshazzar himself stood frozen for a moment, the weight of prophecy and the reality of conquest crashing together in his mind like colliding worlds. The writing on the wall blazed with undiminished fire, its message now fulfilled before his very eyes. The Medes and Persians had indeed inherited his kingdom, just as the divine hand had written and Daniel had interpreted. The end came swiftly. Persian soldiers, their orders clear and their duty unwavering, moved through the hall with grim efficiency. King Belshazzar, the ruler who had mocked the God of heaven and profaned his holy vessels, fell beneath Persian swords before the night was through. The golden crown that had tumbled from his head lay forgotten on the marble floor, while his blood mingled with the spilled wine from the sacred goblets. Throughout the great city, the same scene was repeated. Persian forces, having entered through the river channels, swept through Babylon like an irresistible tide. The gates were opened from within, the walls manned by conquerors rather than defenders, the mighty empire brought to its knees in a single night of divine judgment. By dawn, Cyrus's standards flew from the towers of Babylon, and Darius the Mede had been installed as the new ruler of the greatest city in the world. The empire that had seemed eternal, the walls that had appeared impregnable, the power that had dominated the known world for generations, all had fallen before the sovereign will of the God who rules in the kingdoms of men. As the sun rose over conquered Babylon, painting the great city in shades of gold and crimson that seemed somehow fitting for its fall, Daniel stood again before the wall where the supernatural writing continued to glow with divine fire. The banquet hall was empty now, save for the debris of the feast and the silent testimony of judgment fulfilled. MENE, MENE, TEKEL, Parsin, the words that had sealed an empire's fate, now served as an eternal reminder of truths that transcend the rise and fall of earthly kingdoms. God had indeed numbered the days of Belshazzar's reign and brought it to an end. The king had been weighed in heaven's perfect scales and found wanting. The kingdom had been divided and given to the Medes and Persians, just as the supernatural hand had written and the faithful prophet had interpreted. The sacred vessels of Solomon's temple, once profaned by blasphemous lips, would soon be restored to their proper place of honour. Under Cyrus's benevolent rule, the Jewish exiles would be free to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, carrying with them the golden cups and silver bowls that had witnessed both the depths of human pride and the certainty of divine justice. Daniel himself, now clothed in the purple of a dying empire, yet serving the eternal kingdom of heaven, had once again demonstrated that those who trust in the Most High God will never be disappointed. Through him, the sovereignty of the Almighty had been proclaimed in the halls of earthly power, and the vanity of human pride had been exposed for all to see. The lesson of that terrible night echoes through the corridors of history, speaking to every generation that dares to lift itself up against the Lord of heaven. Kingdoms rise and fall like waves upon the shore. Empires that seem eternal prove to be as fleeting as morning mist, but the kingdom of God endures forever. No wall can stand against his purposes, no power can resist his will, no pride can escape his judgment. In our own age, when earthly kingdoms still vie for dominion and human pride still challenges heaven's authority, the writing on Babylon's wall remains as relevant as ever. We who read these ancient words would do well to remember that the God who humbled Nebuchadnezzar, who numbered Belshazzar's days, who gave Babylon to the Medes and Persians, is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The scales of divine justice still weigh the actions of nations and individuals. The sovereign hand that writes the destiny of empires still guides the course of human history, and the kingdom that Daniel served, the kingdom that outlasted Babylon and Persia and all the empires that followed, remains the only power that will never pass away. As night falls once again over the ancient site where Babylon once stood in all its glory, as stars appear in the darkness above ruins that once housed the pride of earthly kingdoms. The eternal truth, proclaimed by that supernatural hand, continues to shine with undiminished light. The Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, and blessed are those who humble themselves before his throne. May we who hear this ancient story find in it not merely a tale of judgment long past, but a present reminder of the God who sees all, knows all, and judges all with perfect righteousness. And may we, like Daniel, serve faithfully in whatever earthly kingdom we find ourselves, while keeping our ultimate allegiance to the kingdom that cannot be shaken, the kingdom that endures forever and ever. The writing is on the wall, dear friends. The question that remains is whether we will read it in time to humble ourselves before the King of Kings, or whether we will follow Belshazzar's path to destruction. The choice, as always, is ours to make, is ours to Hello friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. I hope your day has been filled with blessings, no matter what time you're joining us or where you are in this beautiful world. Before we begin tonight's journey into the remarkable story of Gideon, I want to invite you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber so you never miss these powerful biblical narratives that can transform your heart and strengthen your faith. Now let's settle in as we explore one of the most extraordinary accounts of courage, faith, and divine intervention in all of Scripture. The sun hung low over the hills of Israel, casting long shadows across a land that had once flowed with milk and honey. But those days seemed like distant memories now. The once prosperous nation had fallen into chaos, its people scattered and hiding like frightened animals. For 7 long years, the Midianites had swept down upon Israel like locusts, devouring everything in their path. Picture, if you will, the terror that gripped every village and farmstead. Families would wake each morning not knowing if this would be the day the raiders would come. Fathers would venture out to check their crops, only to find them trampled and stolen. Children would be hushed to silence at the first sound of hoofbeats on the horizon. The very air seemed thick with fear and desperation. The Midianites, along with their allies, the Amalekites, and other eastern peoples, had turned the conquest of Israel into an annual ritual. Like a plague of locusts, they would arrive at harvest time, their camels beyond counting, stretching across the landscape as far as the eye could see. They would strip the land bare, taking not only the grain and livestock, but also crushing the spirits of God's chosen people. Farmers had abandoned their fields, choosing instead to hide in mountain caves and underground chambers. The marketplaces that once bustled with commerce now stood empty and silent. What should have been a time of celebration and thanksgiving for the harvest had become a season of dread and starvation. Israel's cities, once proud and strong, had crumbled into mere shadows of their former glory. The walls that should have protected the people lay in ruins, and the gates that once welcomed travellers now hung broken on their hinges. It was as if the very blessing of God had departed from the land, leaving behind only sorrow and defeat. In this atmosphere of despair, mothers would gather their children close and whisper the old stories of how God had delivered their ancestors from Egypt, how he had parted the Red Sea and given them victory over mighty enemies. But those stories seemed like fairy tales now, beautiful but impossible dreams from a time when God still cared about his people. The elders of Israel shook their heads in bewilderment. Where was the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob? Where was the mighty deliverer who had once fought for them? Had he forgotten his covenant? Had he abandoned them to their enemies forever? It was into this world of darkness and desperation that our story begins, in the small town of Ophrah, where a young man named Gideon was about to discover that God had not forgotten his people, after all. But Gideon, like so many others, had lost hope. He had watched his family's livelihood disappear year after year, and he had grown tired of empty promises and unanswered prayers. On this particular day, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, both literally and figuratively, Gideon was engaged in the dangerous work of threshing wheat. But he wasn't doing it in the traditional threshing floor, where the grain could be properly separated from the chaff by the wind. Instead, he was hidden away in a wine press, a place where grapes were normally crushed to make wine. It was cramped, inefficient, and poorly ventilated, but it offered something more valuable than convenience. It offered concealment from enemy eyes. As Gideon worked in his makeshift hiding place, sweat dripping from his brow in the confined space, he embodied the broken spirit of his entire nation. Here was a man reduced to secret, fearful labour just to provide basic sustenance for his family. The very act of threshing wheat, once a joyful community celebration, had become a furtive, isolated struggle for survival. Little did Gideon know that this moment of apparent defeat would become the launching pad for one of the most remarkable displays of God's power in human history. The God who seemed absent was actually watching, waiting, and preparing to use this unlikely hero in ways that would astound both friend and foe alike. The rhythm of Gideon's work was steady but tense. Each strike of his flail against the wheat stalks echoed softly in the confined space of the wine press. His eyes darted frequently toward the opening above, watching for any sign of danger. The precious grain he was salvaging represented not just food for today, but hope for tomorrow, assuming the Midianites didn't discover his hiding place. The silence of the afternoon was broken by an unexpected voice. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon's heart nearly stopped. He spun around, flail raised defensively, expecting to see a Midianite scout who had somehow discovered his secret location. Instead, he found himself face to face with a figure unlike any he had ever encountered. The stranger sat calmly beneath the great oak tree that overlooked the wine press, his presence somehow both commanding and peaceful. The greeting struck Gideon as almost mockingly ironic. Mighty warrior? Him? The man who was reduced to threshing wheat in secret, constantly looking over his shoulder in fear. And the Lord is with you? If that were true, then why was Israel suffering under such devastating oppression? "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, his voice heavy with skepticism and pain. "But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The words poured out of Gideon like water from a broken dam. Years of frustration, disappointment, and unanswered questions came tumbling forth. He had grown up hearing the magnificent stories of God's mighty deeds, of pillars of fire and cloud, of armies defeated and nations subdued. But where was that God now? Where were those miracles when his people needed them most? The stranger listened patiently to Gideon's outburst, showing no offence at the young man's boldness or apparent lack of faith. There was something in his eyes that spoke of ancient wisdom and unlimited compassion. When Gideon finished speaking, the visitor's response was both simple and earth-shattering. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" The audacity of the command took Gideon's breath away. Save Israel? Him? The implications were staggering. This wasn't a request for him to join an army or support a cause. This was a divine commission to personally lead the deliverance of an entire nation from a seemingly impossible situation. "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon stammered, his mind reeling, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." Gideon's response revealed the depth of his feelings of inadequacy. In a culture where tribal strength and family position determined social standing and influence, he saw himself as doubly disqualified. His clan held no political power, commanded no great armies, and possessed no significant wealth. Within that already weak clan, he was the youngest, the most inexperienced, the least likely to be chosen for any position of leadership. But the stranger's next words would echo through the ages as one of the most profound promises ever given to a human being. "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." The promise was comprehensive and absolute. Not some of the Midianites, not most of them, but all of them. The victory would be complete and decisive, but more importantly, it would not depend on Gideon's strength, wisdom, or experience. It would depend entirely on the presence and power of God himself. Still struggling to believe what he was hearing, Gideon made a request that would reveal both his desire for faith and his need for certainty. "If now I have found favour in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you." The stranger agreed to wait, and Gideon hurried to his house to prepare an offering. His heart raced as he worked, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared a young goat and made bread from an ephah of flour. This was not a small offering by the standards of his time, especially for a family struggling under the oppression of constant raids. Yet something within him compelled him to give generously, to honour this mysterious visitor properly. When Gideon returned with the prepared food, the stranger instructed him to place the meat and unleavened bread on a rock and pour out the broth. Gideon obeyed, though he couldn't understand the purpose of these strange instructions. What happened next would leave no doubt about the supernatural nature of his visitor. The stranger touched the meat and bread with the tip of the staff he carried, and immediately fire flared from the rock, consuming the entire offering in an instant. The flames burned with an intensity and heat that no ordinary fire could match, leaving nothing behind but the memory of their brilliance. In that same moment, the stranger vanished from sight, disappearing as suddenly and mysteriously as he had appeared. Terror gripped Gideon's heart as the full realization of what had just occurred crashed over him like a mighty wave. This had been no ordinary man, no mere messenger or prophet. This had been the angel of the Lord, a manifestation of God himself. In that moment of understanding, Gideon was overwhelmed not with joy, but with mortal fear. "Alas, sovereign Lord," he cried out in anguish, "I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." In the ancient world, it was believed that no human could see God and live. The very encounter that should have filled him with confidence instead filled him with terror. Had his boldness in questioning and testing the Lord sealed his doom? Would he die for having stood in the presence of the Almighty? But even in his moment of greatest fear, God's grace reached out to comfort him. The voice of the Lord came to him again, gentle and reassuring. Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die. With his own hands, Gideon built an altar on that spot and called it, "The Lord is Peace." The place where he had threshed wheat in fear and desperation had become holy ground, the site of a divine encounter that would change not only his life, but the destiny of an entire nation. As night fell over Ophrah, Gideon stood beside his new altar, his mind swirling with the magnitude of what had occurred. The God of his ancestors had not abandoned Israel after all. He had been working, planning, preparing for this very moment, and somehow, incredibly, he had chosen Gideon to be his instrument of deliverance. Yet even as faith began to bloom in his heart, doubt lingered like shadows at the edges of his mind. The task before him seemed impossible, the odds insurmountable. How could he, one man from the weakest clan in Manasseh, possibly hope to defeat the countless multitudes of Midian and their allies? It was a question that would lead him to make one of the most famous requests for divine confirmation in all of Scripture. The days following Gideon's encounter with the angel of the Lord were filled with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The divine commissioning had been clear and unmistakable, yet the human heart, prone to doubt and fear, struggled to fully embrace what seemed impossible. Gideon found himself caught between the supernatural certainty of his calling and the natural uncertainties of his circumstances. As he went about his daily tasks, Gideon's mind constantly returned to that moment when fire had consumed his offering and the angel had vanished from sight. Had it really happened? In the bright light of day, with the familiar sounds and sights of ordinary life surrounding him, the encounter almost seemed like a dream. Yet the altar he had built stood as a permanent reminder, its stones bearing witness to the reality of what had occurred. Word began to spread quietly through the region about Gideon's calling. Some believed and were filled with hope for the first time in years. Others were skeptical, wondering how this young man could possibly succeed where so many others had failed. Still others were fearful, worried that any attempt at resistance would only bring more severe retaliation from their oppressors. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on Gideon's shoulders. He was being asked not just to risk his own life, but potentially to lead others to their deaths. What if he had misunderstood? What if his faith had somehow led him astray? The consequences of a mistake would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for all who would follow him. It was in this state of mind that Gideon made his famous request for divine confirmation. The fleece test, as it would come to be known, represented not a lack of faith, but rather a deep desire for certainty in the face of overwhelming responsibility. "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised," Gideon prayed earnestly, "look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece, and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." The request was specific and measurable. In the normal course of nature, dew would form on all surfaces exposed to the night air. If God could reverse this natural process, causing moisture to collect only on the fleece, while leaving the surrounding ground completely dry, it would serve as an unmistakable sign of divine intervention. Gideon placed the fleece carefully on the threshing floor as evening approached. All through the night he must have awakened periodically, wondering what he would find in the morning. As dawn broke, he hurried to the spot where he had placed his test. What he discovered filled him with wonder and awe. The fleece was thoroughly saturated with dew, so much so that when he wrung it out, he was able to fill an entire bowl with water. Yet all around it, the ground was completely dry, as if an invisible barrier had prevented any moisture from settling anywhere but on the wool. The sign was clear and unmistakable, yet Gideon's human nature craved even greater certainty. The magnitude of what he was being called to do seemed to justify asking for additional confirmation. With remarkable humility and boldness, he approached God with yet another request. "Do not be angry with me," Gideon prayed, acknowledging that his repeated testing might seem to indicate a lack of trust. "Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew." This second test was even more remarkable than the first. It would be one thing for God to cause dew to collect on a single object, while keeping the surrounding area dry, but it would be quite another to keep one small piece of wool completely dry while saturating everything around it. This second sign would demonstrate not just God's power over nature, but his precise control over the smallest details. Again, Gideon placed the fleece on the threshing floor and waited through the night. When morning came, he found exactly what he had requested. The fleece was bone dry without a trace of moisture, while the ground all around it sparkled with heavy dew. The grass, the stones, the nearby trees, everything was wet with the night's moisture, except for that one small piece of wool. God had patiently granted both requests, demonstrating not anger at Gideon's need for reassurance, but understanding and compassion for human weakness. The fleece tests revealed important truths about the nature of faith and the character of God. Faith is not the absence of questions or doubts. Rather, it is the willingness to act in obedience despite those questions and doubts. Moreover, God's response to Gideon's requests showed his patience with those who seek him earnestly. He did not rebuke Gideon for his need for confirmation, nor did he withdraw his calling because of the young man's hesitation. Instead, he graciously provided the assurance that Gideon needed to step forward in faith. The fleece tests also demonstrated the balance between seeking divine guidance and taking action. There comes a point when further testing can become an excuse for inaction, when the desire for certainty becomes a barrier to obedience. Gideon wisely limited his requests to 2 clear signs, then proceeded to act on what he had received. As news of these miraculous signs spread throughout the tribes of Israel, hope began to stir in hearts that had been dormant for years. Perhaps God had not forgotten them after all. Perhaps deliverance was indeed coming through this unlikely young man from Ophrah. But before Gideon could lead Israel into battle against their oppressors, he would need to assemble an army. The call went out throughout the territories of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. Men who had been hiding in caves and mountain strongholds began to emerge, drawn by the promise of freedom and the reports of God's miraculous confirmations. The response was overwhelming. 32,000 men answered the call, a substantial army by any measure. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers and craftsmen, fathers and sons, united by their hatred of oppression and their desperate hope for liberation. They came carrying whatever weapons they could find, swords that had been hidden from enemy raids, spears hastily fashioned from farming tools, bows that had been used for hunting game in the wilderness. As Gideon looked out over this vast assembly of volunteers, he might have felt a surge of confidence. Surely with 32,000 men, even amateur fighters, he could mount a credible challenge to the Midianite forces. The odds were still daunting, given that the enemy could field armies many times larger, but at least now they had a fighting chance. Yet God had other plans. The fleece tests had been preparation not just for Gideon's faith, but for an even greater demonstration of divine power. The true test was not whether Gideon could trust God with impossible signs, but whether he could trust God with an impossible strategy. What happened next would shock both Gideon and his army, challenging every human assumption about warfare and victory. God was about to demonstrate that his ways are not our ways, and that his power is made perfect, not in human strength, but in human weakness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the camp as 32,000 men prepared for what they believed would be their march to war. Weapons were sharpened, provisions were packed, and final prayers were offered. The air buzzed with nervous energy as farmers turned warriors contemplated the battle that lay ahead. Gideon moved among his troops, offering words of encouragement and trying to project the confidence that a leader must display. Yet privately, he was still awed by the magnitude of what was happening. Just weeks earlier, he had been hiding in a wine press, and now he stood at the head of the largest volunteer army Israel had assembled in generations. But as the army prepared to march toward the enemy encampment, God spoke to Gideon with words that must have sent shockwaves through his entire being. "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. Our own strength has saved us." Too many men? The statement seemed to defy all military logic. The Midianites and their allies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their camels alone described as being like locusts for multitude. How could 32,000 possibly be considered too many? Yet God's reasoning revealed a profound truth about the nature of divine deliverance. If Israel won the coming battle through conventional military means, they would inevitably credit their victory to their own strength, strategy, and courage. The victory needed to be so obviously supernatural that no one could mistake its source. God's glory was at stake, and that glory could not be shared with human pride. Following God's instructions, Gideon stood before his assembled army and made an announcement that must have stunned many of the volunteers. Anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. The offer was based on an ancient law found in Deuteronomy, which recognized that fearful soldiers could spread panic through the ranks and actually weaken an army's effectiveness. But in this case, the dismissal served a different purpose entirely. God was beginning the process of reducing the army to a size that would make his intervention unmistakable. The response to Gideon's announcement was immediate and devastating. 22,000 men took advantage of the opportunity to withdraw from what many probably saw as a suicide mission anyway. These were not cowards in the traditional sense. They were ordinary people facing an extraordinary situation, and they chose the safety of their families over the uncertainties of battle. As Gideon watched more than 2/3 of his army walk away, his heart must have sunk. 10,000 men remained, still a respectable force, but far fewer than what seemed necessary for the task ahead. Surely now they could proceed with God's blessing. But God was not finished with his reductions. "There are still too many men," came the divine word. "Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say, 'This one shall go with you,' he shall go. But if I say, 'This one shall not go with you,' he shall not go." The instruction was puzzling and specific. Gideon was to observe how the men drank water and select his final army based on their drinking method. Of all the criteria that might be used to choose warriors, how they consumed water seemed among the least relevant to military prowess. At the water's edge, the 10,000 men revealed their character through their approach to drinking. The vast majority knelt down and put their faces directly to the water, drinking deeply and focusing entirely on satisfying their thirst. But a small group, only 300 men, demonstrated a different approach. They brought water to their mouths with their hands, lapping it like dogs while maintaining their vigilance and readiness. God's instruction was clear. With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home. The reduction was complete and shocking. From 32,000 to 300 represented a decrease of more than 99%. What had begun as a substantial army was now reduced to little more than a large company. The odds, already daunting, had become mathematically absurd. Yet the selection criteria revealed profound spiritual truths. The 300 men who were chosen had demonstrated alertness, self-discipline, and readiness, even in a moment of personal need. While drinking, they had maintained their awareness of their surroundings, prepared for action at a moment's notice. These qualities, while admirable in soldiers, were really symbols of spiritual preparedness and faithfulness. As the dismissed soldiers departed, taking most of the weapons and supplies with them, Gideon was left with 300 men who looked more like a ceremonial guard than a fighting force. The enemy they faced was described in terms that emphasized their overwhelming numbers. All the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. The disparity was so extreme that it moved beyond the realm of military strategy into the realm of the miraculous. No human commander would voluntarily reduce his forces to such a level when facing such overwhelming odds. Yet this was precisely God's point. The victory that was coming would be so clearly divine in origin that no one could attribute it to human planning or prowess. For Gideon, this final reduction must have been the ultimate test of faith. Everything in his military thinking, everything in his natural instincts, everything in conventional wisdom screamed against such a strategy. Yet his experiences with the fleece had prepared him for this moment. He had learned to trust God's ways even when they contradicted human logic. The 300 men who remained showed remarkable faith as well. They could see the enemy forces spread across the valley below them. They knew the odds better than anyone, yet they chose to stay, to trust in the God who had called them through his servant Gideon. As night fell over the Israelite camp, the 300 men prepared for what would be the most unconventional battle in military history. They had no idea that they were about to participate in a victory that would be remembered and celebrated for thousands of years. A victory that would demonstrate God's power to use the weak to confound the mighty. The stage was set for a night that would change everything. The Midianites slept in their countless tents, confident in their overwhelming superiority. The 300 Israelites made their final preparations, trusting in a God who specialized in impossible victories. The hours before dawn are often the darkest, both literally and figuratively. As Gideon and his 300 men crouched in the hills overlooking the vast enemy encampment, the weight of their impossible mission pressed down upon them like a physical burden. The valley below was filled with the tents of their enemies, stretching as far as the eye could see in the starlight, a sea of canvas that housed an army larger than any they had ever faced. Despite the miraculous signs he had witnessed and the divine assurances he had received, Gideon still struggled with doubt. God, in his infinite understanding of human nature, provided one more confirmation before the battle commenced. "Get up, go down against the camp," the Lord instructed, "because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." The offer revealed God's compassionate understanding of Gideon's anxiety. Rather than rebuking him for his continued fears, the Lord provided an opportunity for reassurance. Taking his servant Purah with him, Gideon crept down toward the perimeter of the enemy camp under cover of darkness. The Midianite camp was massive beyond imagination. Thousands upon thousands of tents housed warriors from multiple nations united in their conquest of Israel. The sounds of the sleeping army filled the night air, snoring soldiers, restless camels, the occasional challenge of sentries. The very scale of the enemy forces should have been overwhelming to any reasonable observer. As Gideon and Purah approached the outer edge of the camp, they overheard a conversation between two Midianite soldiers. One was telling his companion about a disturbing dream he had experienced. "I had a dream. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." The interpretation offered by his fellow soldier was even more remarkable. "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." The irony was profound. Here in the heart of the enemy camp, God was providing confirmation through the mouths of Israel's oppressors themselves. The barley bread in the dream was significant. Barley was considered the food of the poor, inferior to wheat. Yet in the dream, this humble loaf had the power to destroy the entire enemy position. The symbolism was clear. God would use the humble and despised to bring down the mighty and proud. That Gideon's name was already known to the enemy indicated that word of the gathering Israelite resistance had reached their ears. Rather than being encouraged by their overwhelming numerical superiority, some among the Midianites were apparently experiencing anxiety about this upstart Hebrew leader. God was already working in the hearts and minds of the enemy, preparing them for defeat. Gideon and Purah retreated to their own lines, hearts pounding with excitement and renewed confidence. The doubt that had plagued Gideon was finally dispelled by this remarkable confirmation. When they reached the Israelite position, Gideon called his men together for final instructions. "Get up," he announced with newfound authority and confidence. "The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." What followed was perhaps the most unusual battle plan in military history. Instead of swords and spears, Gideon distributed trumpets, empty clay jars, and torches to each of his 300 men. The weapons of conventional warfare were set aside in favour of items that seemed more suited to a religious ceremony than a military campaign. Gideon divided his small force into 3 companies of 100 men each. The strategy was simple, yet audacious. They would surround the enemy camp and at Gideon's signal create as much noise and confusion as possible, while giving the appearance of a much larger force. "Watch me," Gideon instructed his men. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" The plan required perfect timing and coordination. Each man would conceal his torch inside a clay jar, maintaining complete darkness and silence until the moment of attack. Then at Gideon's signal, they would simultaneously break their jars, revealing blazing torches, blow their trumpets with all their might, and shout their battle cry. The psychological impact was designed to be devastating. The enemy would suddenly find themselves surrounded by lights and noise, creating the impression of a massive attacking force. In the confusion of a night assault, with limited visibility and the disorientation of being awakened from sleep, even experienced soldiers could panic and lose their sense of direction. As the 3 companies moved into position around the vast perimeter of the enemy camp, each man must have felt the weight of the moment. They were not professional soldiers, but ordinary citizens who had answered the call to fight for their freedom. Now they found themselves in the most critical moment of their lives, armed with the most unconventional weapons imaginable. trusting in a God who had promised victory through seemingly impossible means. The middle watch around midnight was traditionally the time when sentries were changed, and vigilance was often at its lowest point. It was at this precise moment that Gideon and his 100 men reached their assigned position on the edge of the camp. Across the valley, 200 other men waited in similar positions, every eye fixed on their leader for the signal that would begin the battle. Gideon raised his torch-filled jar high above his head, then brought it down sharply, smashing it against a rock. The clay shattered with a sound that seemed to echo across the silent valley, and immediately his torch blazed forth in the darkness. At the same instant, he lifted his trumpet to his lips and blew a long, piercing blast. "For the Lord and for Gideon!" he shouted at the top of his lungs. The signal rippled around the camp as 300 jars smashed simultaneously. 300 torches burst into flame, and 300 trumpet heights sounded their defiant call. The battle cry of "For the Lord and for Gideon" echoed from every direction, creating the impression that the Midianite camp was completely surrounded by a massive army. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Thousands of sleeping soldiers were jolted awake to find their camp surrounded by blazing lights and deafening noise. In the confusion and darkness, panic spread like wildfire through the ranks. Soldiers stumbled from their tents, grabbing whatever weapons they could find, unable to determine the size or direction of the attacking force. In their panic and confusion, the Midianites and their allies began attacking each other. Unable to distinguish friend from foe in the darkness, and hearing battle cries in their own languages from every direction, they assumed they had been betrayed by their allies. The coalition that had seemed so formidable began to tear itself apart. The 300 Israelites maintained their positions around the perimeter, continuing to blow their trumpets and hold their torches high, creating the illusion of a massive army that had the enemy completely surrounded. They watched in amazement as God fulfilled his promise in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The panic spread throughout the entire camp like a plague. What had begun as confusion quickly escalated into a full-scale rout as the enemy forces fled in every direction, abandoning their weapons, supplies, and even their camels in their desperate attempt to escape what they perceived as certain destruction. The victory was complete and overwhelming, achieved not through superior numbers or military might, but through divine intervention, working through the obedience of 300 faithful men. The God who had called Gideon from his hiding place in the winepress had once again demonstrated that his power is made perfect in human weakness. As dawn broke over the valley, an astonishing sight greeted the 300 Israelites. Where the night before had stood the mighty encampment of Israel's oppressors, now lay only scattered debris and abandoned supplies. Tents stood empty, their guy ropes cut by fleeing soldiers. Weapons lay discarded where they had fallen from panicked hands. The camels that had been described as innumerable as locusts wandered aimlessly, their owners having fled into the wilderness. The ground itself told the story of the night's chaos. Bloodstains marked the spots where confused allies had struck down one another in the darkness. Personal belongings were strewn across the landscape as the fleeing army had abandoned everything that might slow their escape. The scene looked less like the aftermath of a battle and more like the remnants of a catastrophic natural disaster. Gideon and his men moved through the abandoned camp in wonder, scarcely believing what their eyes were witnessing. The victory was so complete, so overwhelming, that it seemed almost too good to be true. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The army that had terrorized Israel for 7 years had been routed by 300 men armed with trumpets and torches. But God's deliverance was not yet complete. Even as the 300 marvelled at what had occurred in the valley, word of the miraculous victory was spreading throughout the hill country of Israel. Men who had dismissed Gideon's call to arms, who had remained hidden in their caves and strongholds, now emerged with renewed courage and determination. The tribes of Naphtali, Asher and Manasseh rallied to pursue the fleeing Midianites. What had begun with 300 faithful men now swelled into a national movement of liberation. The psychological impact of the victory was as important as the military result. The myth of Midianite invincibility had been shattered in a single night, and the spirit of resistance that had been dormant for so long now burst forth like a river breaking through a dam. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim with urgent instructions. Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth Barah. This strategic move would cut off the enemy's escape routes and ensure that the victory would be complete. The Ephraimites responded with enthusiasm, capturing the fords of the Jordan and trapping many of the fleeing Midianites. In the pursuit that followed, they captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb, whose names meant raven and wolf. These princes, who had struck terror into Israelite hearts for years, were now defeated and killed at the places that would forever bear their names: the rock of Oreb and the winepress of Zeb. The pursuit continued beyond the Jordan as Gideon and his original 300, though exhausted, pressed on to capture the remaining Midianite kings, Zaba and Zalmunna. The victory was total and decisive. An empire that had dominated the region for 7 years was completely destroyed in a matter of days. The land of Israel enjoyed peace for 40 years during Gideon's lifetime. The oppression that had driven families into hiding was replaced by prosperity and security. Fields that had been abandoned were cultivated again. Markets that had stood empty bustled with commerce. Children who had grown up knowing only fear could now play freely in their villages. But perhaps the greatest victory was not military but spiritual. Israel had rediscovered that their God was still the same mighty deliverer who had brought their ancestors out of Egypt. The impossible victory served as a permanent reminder that with God all things are possible. The story of Gideon and the 300 speaks across the centuries, with timeless truths that challenge and encourage us today. First, we see that God uses the unlikely. Gideon was not a seasoned warrior or a natural leader. He was a fearful farmer, hiding from his enemies. Yet God saw potential that others missed. This reminds us that God's calling is not based on our qualifications, but on his purposes. Second, the reduction of Gideon's army from 32,000 to 300 demonstrates that faith matters more than numbers. In a world obsessed with statistics and metrics, God's economy operates differently. He delights in using small faithful remnants to accomplish great things, ensuring that his power, not human strength, receives the glory. Third, Gideon's requests for signs teach us about the balance between faith and doubt. God was patient with Gideon's need for confirmation, showing us that honest questions and requests for reassurance are not signs of weak faith but of a heart that desires to walk in God's will. Finally, the story shows us that obedience in the face of fear is the essence of courage. Gideon was afraid, his army was outnumbered, and the strategy seemed foolish. Yet they obeyed, and God honoured their faithfulness with victory. When we feel unqualified for the tasks before us, when the odds seem insurmountable, when we need reassurance before taking steps of faith, the story of Gideon reminds us that our God specialises in impossible victories. He is still calling ordinary people to extraordinary purposes, still using the weak to confound the mighty, still turning fearful hearts into faithful warriors. The God who met Gideon at the winepress is the same God who meets us in our hiding places today, calling us to step out in faith and watch him work miracles through surrendered lives. Just as the 300 trumpets and torches became instruments of divine victory, our simple obedience can become the means through which God accomplishes his purposes in our generation. May we have the courage to answer when he calls, the faith to trust when he leads, and the persistence to follow when he sends us into battles that seem impossible to win. For with God, the 300 can defeat the multitudes, and faith can move mountains that seem immovable. The story of Gideon reminds us that our greatest victories come not when we feel strong and capable, but when we acknowledge our weakness and depend completely on God's strength. In those moments of surrender, we discover that we serve a God who delights in doing the impossible through the most unlikely people. And so the story ends where it began, with an invitation to faith, a call to courage, and a promise that the God who delivered Israel through Gideon and the 300 is still delivering his people today, one impossible victory at a time.